Welcome back, guys, to another video. And today's episode of the War for the World Survival, my book series that I am doing here on the channel that I've been doing for quite a while, if you guys remember. I wanted to post a video today to kind of go over a kind of a huge event that will be in the book going forward. This is actually something I haven't written yet, which will be being written soon as I get back in the hang of writing again. But yeah, so I hope you guys are excited to get into it. Today is going to be jumping quite a far timeline wise into the book, so we're going to be jumping pretty much about 20 or so years into the future from the last episode, just because I'm kind of doing some time jumping stuff to kind of add a little more flavor to the book's background while I do the main story. So we're going to go into the events of April the 8th of 2120. 2120 is a horrific year for the EDF going forward. This is going to be one of the worst years of the war for them, at least back home. And we're going to go through the events of the trial and kind of going into what went wrong and what was the consequences of those actions. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So um, on the eve of 2119, the um, EDF wanted a huge victory over the Exil. Right? They needed a victory. By this point, they were having a kind of a rough time. They had been going on an early big win streak back in the early 2100s. The last several years after the events of 2115, 2116, 2117. Those 3 years, there was a big battles that would happen, which we'll talk about in the future. But basically, things weren't going so well, and they needed a victory to kind of boost morale again. Now, near the Himalayas, there is a area in this universe. There's an area where there's a flat land near the Himalayas, but it's kind of like a river valley almost. Kind of, it's like a flat river valley, if it makes any sense. So it's a very weird design where there's rough hills and flatness in between each hill. This covers about 48 square miles of distance. The EDF knows there's an Exil stronghold somewhere in the Himalayan mountains. The Exil have been known to do this. They'll dig into strong, fortified, natural barriers. And they know the humans really struggle around the Himalayas because of the oxygen furlough. So guys going in there usually would need special equipment or special training. And the Exil knew that the humans, or the EDF, wouldn't be able to acquire the right gear for the right amount of numbers of troops to take the objective. And so they felt kind of safe here. So guarding the defense for the Exil was pretty simple. They had 14 30 millimeter anti-personnel carrier guns positioned on every corner of the hillside. These things could shoot upwards around 30,000 rounds a second. These were very deadly weapons. These were usually things on the aircraft the Exil used. And they had about 356 mortars scattered throughout the mountain, and basically the entire of that Mount Everest was the Himalayas was completely covered in artillery. So on the end of June of 2119, the EDF formed the 5th Brigade. This brigade had been formed for quite a while. It was basically a bunch of U.S. Rangers, U.S. Marines, and a bunch of former EDF Rangers as well. This brigade was a bunch of guys from the Midwest, a bunch of guys from the South, and a bunch of guys from Mexico and Canada, basically immigrants, people who had to flee those countries to get to the U.S. And the 5th Brigade ranged about 35 to 40,000 men. It's a strong brigade, very strong in terms of the numbers. I mean, most brigades at this time ranging from about 10 to 15,000, which is why you will see a lot of battles have about a shit ton of brigades. We're talking 30, 40 brigades, but this brigade was believed to have been able to handle itself solo. And so the date was picked, April the 8th, 2120. The events of April the 8th are infamous within the global spectrum on the community. Okay, April the 8th is one of the most devastating days um, in the war. I mean, there's a lot of devastating days in the war, but this was completely a disaster, and the entire brigade, except for one man, um, ultimately paid their price. So let's fast forward to the battle and kind of get into it. So on April the 8th, about 8 a.m., the EDF forces, the 5th Brigade, they arrived on the southwest slope of this valley. Now, the game plan was pretty simple. There's a short valley in the center of these peaks. To the west side of the peak, so the opposite of where the EDF currently is, there was believed to be the Exil entrenchment. The 35,000 were going to launch an attack at lunchtime, and the idea was by at least 7 or 8 o'clock that night that the EDF troops would be able to overwhelm the Exil position and take control. At 10 a.m., the EDF began the assault. The EDF didn't have no artillery support, they had no aircraft support, and they had no reinforcements. The brigade that was being sent in, that was it. They were dropped off and left to die, pretty much. The EDF waited a few hours. They actually pushed the attack down from originally was hopefully around 10 to around lunchtime. The attack was destined to start, according to the high command. They actually pushed it down to about 1 o'clock. The reason for this is because the Exil knew they were there, obviously. I mean, 35,000 troops on a mountainside is pretty fucking obvious. Um, so the Exil just launched non-stop bombardment on the American and EDF positions. The 5th Brigade began their assault at 1 p.m., and upon coming over the first basically hill, they used more of an entrenchment. They were kind of on the back side of the hill. They pushed up the hill, up over the top, and dropped down into the next valley. They were immediately woken to the realization of the 30 millimeter anti-personnel cannons and machine gun turrets. They were very quickly familiar with the sounds. The survivor, which he'll say in his testimony in court with the EDF counsel, he would declare the sound as hearing a tornado and a tsunami at the same time of hail. I mean, these are shooting millions of rounds in the blink of an eye. The first wave was decimated. They were not prepared for that type of offense. They had known that there was going to be offense, but they had no idea of the caliber, which is something we'll get into again in the court side of this video, talking about the events that kind of sealed the fate of the day. By 1:30, less than 30 minutes, the second and third waves, so they broke up into three kind of waves, hoping that the first wave would be able to get a little bit of chunk of distance ahead. The second wave would come in, and then shortly after the third wave, that's why they're not kind of piling on top of each other. Which is a good tactic, by the way. It was a great tactic. It just so happened that everything else that could go wrong did go wrong that day. The first wave decimated. They were trapped in this first valley. The fire was becoming so unrelenting from the Exil that the edges of the mountain or these hills were becoming sawed off, like someone had been taking a knife to it and then sculpting it. So when the second wave came around the cliff, this little ridge line, they were also hit severely. Now the second wave actually fared pretty well. They took a lot less casualties initially than the first wave did. But unfortunately, in the chaos, the third wave got way too aggressive way too quickly. They shortly after began their approach to the ridgeline, and they began crossing over this embankment. Unfortunately, in the process, they had also realized that the entrenchment had been knocked down about 5 feet. So now they had 5 feet less of protection before being shot at, meaning that the troops were getting mowed down way earlier than the other troop attacks. The third wave is reported to have no survivors, according to the survivor of the events. The first wave had about 10,000. The second wave had about 14,500. The last wave had, on average, about 7,000 or so is the estimate. But these numbers are often skewed since the only survivor was just a private. He was not a sergeant or anything, so he had no idea of the exact numbers. So take the numbers with a grain of salt. But not a single man is believed to have survived the third wave. Um, Now, obviously, maybe some of the guys did, and they pushed it in the second wave and got lumped in. But it is believed the third wave never made it to the rest of the waves entrenchment. By 2 p.m., less than an hour into the battle, over 79% of the entire force that had pushed were dead. The next wave, which would be the second wave, they continued their advance, and they actually collided with the first wave. Now, the first wave only had a couple thousand survivors out of the 10,000. I think about 9,000 had died in the initial assault, so they were weak. And these guys have been pinned down since that initial assault. So they've been pinned down now for over an hour, being constantly bombarded by these mortars. And the mortars, they said, were like raining meatballs of disaster. One would land right in front of you, then behind, then beside you, and then you would become the next target of the mortars. And these they say that these mortars were so accurate it was unhuman, which the Exil are obviously not human, so that makes sense. They were so pinpoint accurate. Some of the most pinpoint accuracy for mortars that a lot of these guys had ever seen. And a lot of these guys were experienced fighters against the Exil. Some of these dudes have been in the Rangers for quite a while. So for them to be shocked at how accurate they were was a statement. So by 2:30, the second wave had been all but annihilated. So the survivors of the first and second waves, possibly third wave, were now lumped up on this second ravine. That's right, they only made it past the first ravine. There was a belief to be at least 3 ravines they would have to cross over before the final flat area where the Exil were believed to be stationed. Now the second ravine that they were now going to have to push would be the worst ravine of the three. This third one would be the easiest because it's kind of too close to the machine guns. They couldn't aim down good enough. But the second one, that was the worst. They were in perfect line of sight of machine guns because at this point the machine guns have been kind of wearing down that second ravine, kind of loosening it so they could get more accuracy. But the mortars were in better accuracy. They were closer, meaning that it was a lot easier for the Exo to see them. And they literally look down the mountain and see them, the men sitting in the ravine, and just target it. And it would be like a crab shoot. Within 15 minutes of crossing the last ravine, the events of April the 8th would go from horrific to the most painful 15 minutes of anyone's existence. The men had two options, as laid out by the single survivor: retreat and be shot in the back, or progress and die. Two options. So there was a third option, but no one wanted to hear it, which was just stay still, don't move, hold out. And no one in the regiment was going to do that. So they believed the best option was to progress. Maybe the grace of God would lean on their shoulders and help them fight through the last 2 ravines. But the events, well, they were written in stone. Within 15 minutes, the last remaining few thousand men would make their approach and be slaughtered on the way down of the second approach. The single survivor reported that he was um, behind someone when they went over the ridgeline, which the other guy was blown back by a mortar, slapping him in the chest with his body, forcing him to fall backwards and break his leg and his arm. And having this dude lay on top of him, a corpse with a broken arm and a leg, just made it impossible to get the body off. And he wrote in his statement to the court that the screams of the pain from his fellow soldiers echoed throughout the valley. And then there was silence. No yelling, no gunfire, no crying, no yelling or screaming in pain, just silence. He reported that he laid there for at least 3 days prior to being able to, you know, get himself out of the situation and kind of get himself back to safety. Um, so that is the events of April the 8th. So let's go into some of the more rough things that kind of led to the disaster. And to fully understand this, we have to go all the way back to 2019. Okay, 2119. The intelligence agencies of the EDF, they had pre-planned this battle. They had spent months planning this thing, and they spent all this time planning. Okay, months and months and months and months planning. But there was a list of mistakes that they had made that would not be discovered for quite a long time, including the case. This case would end up being a shit show, a sham at that. But the mistakes that we know they made were they underestimated the Exil force. It was believed that there was only two of the 30 millimeter cannons, only 100 mortars, and about 1,000 Exil infantry located at this objective. In reality, as we talked about earlier, there was multiple more, or double, triple the amount of 30 millimeters. There was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mortars, and there was over 13,000 Exil infantry, and not just any infantry either. These were hard fighting. These were the Third Corps Exil. These were some of the best heavily armored infantry the Exil had, because it turned out this was a fort operating base for the Third Corps. So this was their forward operating base. This was their main front lines objective. So strike one, intelligence agency strike one. All right, first thing off the bat, they've already got wrong. Two, they got the land navigation completely wrong. So the three ravines that I had mentioned was mentioned in the brief, the mission brief. But in actuality, what I didn't tell you is there was actually 7 ravines between the American forces and EDF forces and the Exil. 7. And if you do your math and you realize that, it makes sense because there's 48 square miles between both peaks. One peak is the American EDF, one peak is the Exil. 3 ravines would mean how many miles between each ravine, which just seems a large extent. What turns out to have happened is the satellites had been having issues taking proper photographic pictures of the location, and it had shown only 3 ravines of the 7. The third ravine would be the ravine the Americans and the EDF forces would push in the final 15 minutes. They didn't even make it quarter of the way. Strike 2 for the investigative intelligence agencies. The third strike, and the one that hits the worst, was 20 minutes into the battle. 20. There had been a radio signal sent to the ground forces on April the 8th. The following words: stand down, stand down. It is a trap. Those words never made it to the front lines. They had failed to protect the troops on the front lines. It is believed that the message was received by a ground correspondent. It's believed that he had heard the message, but in the process of trying to get someone to listen to him, including any sergeants or majors there, but unfortunately they had lost two of the three high commands on the field within the first 30 minutes or so, and the third one would die in the last attack. But it is believed that he had took a round somewhere in the time after the message was sent, but it is unclear. They never heard that message. Had they heard that message, the story could be very different. On June the 8th, 2120, there was a court session held. The families of the 5th Battalion, they had sued the EDF for basically manslaughter, because it is believed by the families that this was purposeful, that no EDF operation in the past had this outcome like this one. This one felt personal. In the court case, you will see there is some beliefs that are validated. This is a political scandal, the first big political scandal of the story, and what will lead to future huge political movements that you will see very, very soon in the story. This is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the political scandals. The EDF, well, they weren't the greatest group of people on the earth. The findings found they found that this was a military disaster. They classified it as a magnificent disaster on the military side of the EDF, and the families were all awarded with Purple Hearts and financial stability from the EDF High Command. But obviously, people wanted more. They wanted to know who caused this problem, who caused this event that happened on April the 8th. They would never know. Well, right away. You see, the courts had decided that the people to blame, classic courts, the people to blame and that were held responsible and punished by law were the officers, the three men who led those troops. Three men. Not the commanding officer of the entire brigade, not the officer of the army, the general of the army, not the president of the EDF, no. The three leading sergeants and majors that went in. They were dead. Their bodies laid on the side of a Himalayan mountain. And they were the fault. They were at the fault for the disaster of April the 8th. This sent shockwaves throughout the world. The EDF entire political scale saw huge backlash from these events, from these outcomes, because people deep down knew that those events, they weren't the fault of those young men who went over and died in a random ass mountain in the middle of April. These events could have been stopped prior to them leaving. The final statement from the attorney of the EDF began with a statement, on behalf of the EDF, we apologize for the military disaster that has happened on the events of April the 8th. This event was a catastrophic failure and will never happen again. We send our wishes and prayers to the families of all the troops lost in combat. End quote. The courtroom ran silent as the disrespect of the EDF overwhelmed the people watching. The final words of the single survivor left the entire courtroom in an eerie silence, a silence of pity and pain. He wrote, "The worst feeling about April the 8th was not that we lost. It is that we all died on that mountain, and we didn't kill a single one of them." End quote. Not a single Exil casualty has ever been reported. It is believed that not a single American round or EDF round ever made it to the enemy position. On April the 8th, 35,000 men would be wiped off the planet of the Earth, and all that was left was a blood-soaked snowy mountain in the Himalayas. They would never again attempt to take out this base. And it is believed to this day, which is the war still happening in the universe, that that base still remains. And legend, there's a legend amongst many of the other brigades that a single RPG round from an EDF rocket launcher had struck the enemy lines. And they say, the legend goes anyway, that if you go there today from far away, when the sun is just right, and the clouds just stay away from the sun, the right spot, the right time of day with the right weather, you can see the shadow of the explosion on the enemy fortifications. But that's a legend. That's what they say anyway. April the 8th is a perfect example of a story within the story that I think is a testament to humankind. Because we will sacrifice everything in the name of each other. But there is always a few of us in the world that will do everything in their power to protect our power that we have. The world's full of those people, everywhere. On April the 8th, 35,000 young and old souls met their end. A monument was erected in the EDF National Hall. The 5th Brigade would never recover. Their almost 40,000 strong brigade was down to less than 5,000, and they were never battle ready ever again. The unit would last for a while. It would become a training unit. They would teach the new recruits. This is what EDF did a lot of times with brigades that had seen significant losses or were on the war on the front line for a very, very long time. They would bring them back and put them on training duty to kind of give them some R&R. But there was a curse, many had believed, had been put on the 5th Brigade that day. They had felt like God had left them to die, and there was no way a Supreme Being would sacrifice that many lives on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. And so, because of this belief amongst civilians and military alike, the EDF's 5th Brigade would not see any more recruits. Had the worst recruit pulling of any brigade in the entire army. The 5,000 men still registered under the brigade would serve the brigade for very long, until at least the early 2180s. Many of the men retiring and moving on to civilian jobs, or the younger generation that was still in the unit that was probably now in their middle-aged, adult years, would move on to different units or command roles to high EDF. And then by 2189, the 5th Brigade would be completely dismantled, never to see combat again. Some of the survivors of the brigade meet every year, just like any other brigades reunions. And the few gentlemen that, obviously were not there on the events of April the 8th, but had been a part of the unit during the time, had believed that the 5th Brigade never really truly got a second chance to recuperate from that loss. That loss of April the 8th hung over the heads of those men and women, almost like a dirty sock in the back of your car, right? It just sits there. You never really take it out. Sometimes it just sits there for so long, and it just like you almost forget it exists. And for them, that April the 8th event was that for them. It was the thing in the back seat that constantly just lingered there, but never really went away. By this point, and somewhere in the 2160s, is when the report of the EDF cover-up would come out during a big hack scandal that would happen due to some revolts, some protesting, and it would come out that the EDF's intelligence agency had let down the Fifth Regiment or Fifth Brigade, and it wasn't a day of happy, but it was a day of acceptance for the families of those who lost loved ones on April the 8th, to finally have someone to blame, to have a reason for the disaster that was April the 8th. I mean, there's always, in this story, there's tons of battles in my book, tons of days that are hard because, things just didn't go the way they wanted to go, they needed to go. And there was a huge loss of life, or there's a surprise attack on a city, and the EDF and the US tried their best to hold the lines to get the civilians out, and they just didn't work. But April the 8th was different. It was a day that was completely and utterly useless. That base didn't need to be taken yet. It comes back to the idea that maybe it was on purpose. And there is some evidence to support that. The EDF intelligence agency had some beef with the 5th Brigade previously, prior to the events of April the 8th. They had ran into each other on base a lot, the men of the intelligence and the men of the 5th. And they would oftentimes argue, fight in bars, get into fist fights in the parking lots. Um, the Fifth Brigade oftentimes harassed the intelligence agency for being nerds or geeks, because it was a pretty nerdy profession to be in the agency at this point. I mean, it was pretty manly to be in the war, but to do the intelligence side of things and choose that over fighting with your brothers on the front lines was an interesting dilemma for a lot of men during this age, especially younger generations. The older generations understood the importance of both. The younger generations struggled with that belief, especially being brought up in a world where it's all about war, right? I mean, from the day you're born to the day you die, you're covered in just blood and stains of combat. Um, being a baby in a city that's in a constant state of contact with the exil, or being an adult in the front lines of some foreign country that you're barely able to hold on to. And because of this, there's just a lot of drama that breaks out between the 5th and the intelligence agency, specifically these two, because of the fact that they were both stationed together. A lot of times these EDF agencies were in cities far, far, far away from any military bases, or they had very minimal contact with the infantry. But the base that they were staging at, the 5th Brigade at, just happened to be also an intelligence agency base as well. There's that belief. It is also believed that some form of racism or superiority from the agency also influenced the actions of April the 8th. Looking back on that 20-minute head start about stopping, further digging into that, it does seem to be that the message was purposely withheld from the troops on the ground, because that message was actually recorded 3 hours 3 hours before the attack, but it was only sent 20 minutes into the attack. They sent it 3.5 hours late. How you send a message like that late is still unknown. but they did. And it is believed that there had been some ill intent by the people with the orders. The high ups protected the agency, of course, like they always do. The EDF would cover under the rug, blame the officers of the battle, and pay off the families as much as they could. And case closed. April the 8th has gone down in this story, in this universe, in this entire history of this world, um, as a catastrophe of gigantic proportions. And the men in the 5th, and the men in all the other divisions, and all the other brigades and platoons felt the loss like a family member or a loved one. And a lot of them never recovered from it. But it did boost morale. There was an urge to want to kick some more ass, and you would see a lot of battles be won shortly after the events of April the 8th. And these battles that they won were purely out of anger and aggression. So, in a weird way, I guess the plan to boost morale did indeed work. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys found this interesting. Again, I am working on this book. It will be out soon, probably for the next year or two. I've just been doing a lot of writer's block recently, but I've been delving into deep parts of my mental. I've been doing some huge psychological evaluation stuff on my back end, um, and just researching the brain, and my overall just mental health has been shaky, but I've been learning to give the brain what it needs rather than what I think it needs, um, which is it brought me down some very weird roads, to put it lightly. Um, and yeah, just listening to what my brain needs, when it comes to um, thoughts and better managing what my soul asks. And again, I'm going to delve a lot into uh, all that in Mind Bender Friday, which is coming up. So make sure you watch that episode. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is a short story inside the big story, and so I hope you guys found this interesting. I really enjoy doing the My Book series about short stories within the main story because that way, guys, when you guys read the main story, you guys will have kind of a fresh read. Because I don't want to tell you everything in the story. I want you guys to actually have a reason to want to read it. But this also adds this context because this may be a book about a fictional world, but the people that I'm writing about in the book, the stories that I'm telling, are real in my own mind. They are real people in a real story, suffering real pains, experiencing real loss on a magnitude that I don't think a lot of stories are able to encapsulate, because this isn't a battle being fought in a far distant planet. This is a war being fought for the sake of mankind in our own backyard, literally. So it brings it a little more real, and so I think it's these little short stories within the story kind of bring that element out a little bit more. They're able to um, help people, I think, understand the perspectives of the people involved within this story. But that's just my take on it. If you guys are excited for the book, please leave a like, subscribe, all that stuff down below. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of this short story. Do you guys have if you guys have any questions or interest, let them down below in the comments. I'm always down to help you guys out and read them for you guys. Make sure you join my Discord, my YouTube Discord. I post pretty regularly over there in all the channels, but the book series channel might get a lot more content recently coming up soon. Um, and yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me. I know this has been a long one. I will wrap this up for you, as I know you guys are all busy, busy, busy bees. But yeah, thank you guys so much for all the love and support recently. Um, and I'm just looking forward to the future and hopeful of what God has planned for me. And so I'm very excited to do this journey and to get back on the horse and grind away and maybe we'll see what the new year brings. With that being said, I love you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.